In the flickering candlelight of a chamber buried deep beneath the streets of Paris, 13 knights knelt in silence around an ancient stone altar. The year was 1307, just days before King Philip's soldiers would storm every Templar commandery in France. But these men weren't preparing for battle or praying for deliverance. They were waiting for someone who should. Never have existed a 14th knight whose very presence violated the sacred founding charter of their order. History records that only 9 knights established the Knights Templar in Jerusalem. Yet in the secret archives that survived the purge, encoded letters written in invisible ink, and whispered confessions extracted under torture, another name appears again and again. A name that was systematically erased from official records. A knight whose betrayal didn't just destroy the most powerful organization in medieval Europe. It changed the course of human history in ways we're only beginning to understand. You see, what the history books never tell you is that there was a 14th founder, a brother who existed in the shadows from the very beginning. His name was never spoken in public councils, never inscribed in stone, never recorded in any document meant for outside eyes. But within the inner circle, among those who knew the Order's deepest secrets, he was known simply as the Shadow. And his betrayal wasn't what you think it was. Because sometimes the greatest treachery isn't breaking an oath, it's keeping one that should never have been made. Tonight, we follow the trail of the most dangerous man in Templar history. A knight whose actions echo through the centuries, whose choices shaped the modern world in ways that most people will never know. This isn't just about medieval politics or religious intrigue. This is about secrets so explosive that they had to be buried beneath layers of myth and misdirection. This is about a man who saw what the Knights Templar really were, what they really possessed, and made a choice that would haunt his brothers forever. Like the video and subscribe. Because tonight we uncover the truth about the 14th knight, the man history tried to forget, but whose shadow still falls across the world today. The story begins not in Jerusalem, as you might expect, but in a small village in southern France called Rennes-et-Château. The year is 1116, 2 years before the official founding of the Knights Templar. In this forgotten corner of Languedoc, something extraordinary was about to happen that would set in motion events, whose consequences we still live with today. The village priest, Father Arnaud de Montségur, had just made a discovery that would change his life forever. While conducting repairs on the old church that stood on the site of a much older structure, some said it dated back to the Visigoths, others whispered of Roman origins, and a few elders spoke in hushed tones of even more ancient foundations. He had found a hollow space beneath the altar stone. Inside that space, wrapped in oiled leather that had somehow survived centuries of dampness, was a collection of documents that should not have existed. These weren't ordinary manuscripts, written in a mixture of Latin, Hebrew, and languages that Father Arnaud couldn't identify. They spoke of treasures hidden beneath the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. But these weren't descriptions of gold or silver or precious stones. These documents described something far more valuable and infinitely more dangerous. They contained the location of artifacts from the time of King Solomon, objects that had been deliberately hidden away because of the powers they possessed. Father Arnaud was a learned man, educated in the monasteries of the region, versed in languages and history beyond what was common for a village priest. As he labored through the night by candlelight, translating what he could understand and copying what he couldn't, a terrible realization began to dawn on him. These documents weren't just describing religious relics. They were providing detailed instructions for finding and using objects that the Church would certainly condemn as heretical, perhaps even diabolical. Among the pages was a map, meticulously drawn, showing tunnels and chambers beneath Jerusalem that no crusader had ever mentioned in their accounts of capturing the Holy City. And marked with particular care were locations where specific objects had been hidden just before the Babylonian conquest, sealed away by priests who knew their civilization was about to fall but were determined that certain knowledge would survive. But here's what made Father Arnaud's blood run cold. The documents made it clear that these weren't the only copies. They spoke of the Brotherhood of Keepers, men who had been passing this information down through the centuries, waiting for the right moment to recover what had been hidden. And they mentioned a name that would soon become famous throughout Christendom, Hugues de Payens. Father Arnaud had heard of de Payens. Everyone in the region had. He was a nobleman, a seasoned warrior, and a man known for his intense religious devotion. But according to these documents, de Payens was also the latest in a long line of keepers, men who had been preparing for generations to fulfill a sacred mission, to recover the hidden treasures of Solomon's temple and use them to. Here the translation became difficult, but the implications were clear enough. The objects were meant to be used, not merely preserved. They granted their wielders capabilities that transcended normal human limitations. The priest faced a choice that would echo through history. He could destroy these documents, pretend he had never found them, and return to his simple life in Rennes-le-Château. He could report them to his bishop, who would undoubtedly forward them to higher authorities, setting off a chain reaction whose outcome he couldn't predict. Or he could do something that terrified him, even as the idea formed in his mind. He could contact Hugues de Payens directly. In the end, fear of divine judgment made his decision. If these objects truly existed, if they truly possessed the powers described in these ancient texts, then they were too dangerous to fall into the wrong hands. But they were also too important to simply ignore. Father Arnaud chose to contact de Payens, believing that a man of his reputation and devotion would know what to do. What the priest didn't know was that he was about to set in motion the formation of the Knights Templar, and more importantly, he was about to introduce into that brotherhood a man who should never have been there, man whose presence would ultimately lead to the Order's destruction. 3 months after Father Arnaud sent his carefully coded letter, a stranger arrived in Rennes-le-Château. He was tall, dark-haired, with eyes that seemed to see more than they should. He introduced himself as Geoffroy de Saint-Omer, companion to Hugues de Payens. But there was something about him that immediately put Father Arnaud on edge. Perhaps it was the way he moved, with a grace that seemed almost unnatural. Perhaps it was the intensity of his gaze, as if he were constantly evaluating everything and everyone around him. Or perhaps it was simply the fact that when he spoke, even mundane words seemed to carry hidden meanings. Geoffroy examined the documents with an expertise that surprised the priest. This was no ordinary knight. He could read not just Latin and Hebrew, but the other languages as well, languages that Father Arnault had not encountered in any of his studies. As Geoffroy worked through the manuscripts, his expression shifted from interest to excitement to something that looked disturbingly like hunger. "These are genuine," Geoffroy finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Father, do you understand what you've found? This isn't just information about hidden treasures. This is a key to understanding the true nature of reality itself. The objects described here aren't religious relics in any conventional sense. They're technologies, tools created by a civilization that understood forces we've only begun to glimpse." Father Arnault felt a chill run down his spine. "Technologies? What do you mean?" "These are sacred objects from the time of Solomon." Geoffroy smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Solomon learned his wisdom from somewhere, Father. The Queen of Sheba brought him more than gold and spices. She brought knowledge from the south, from Egypt and lands even further into Africa, places where civilizations rose and fell long before our histories begin. What we call magic or divine power is simply advanced understanding of how consciousness interacts with the physical world. And these objects," he gestured to the documents, "are keys to that understanding." The priest wanted to protest, to insist that such talk was blasphemous. But something in Geoffroy's certainty made him hesitate. "What will you do with this information?" "What we must do," Geoffroy replied. "Husdi, Payans, and others like him have been preparing for this moment for years. We will go to Jerusalem. We will establish ourselves there under the guise of protecting pilgrims, a mission that will give us access to the Temple Mount and the freedom to conduct our search without interference. And we will recover what was hidden there." "And then?" Father Arnault asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Geoffroy's expression became distant, as if he were seeing something far beyond the walls of the church. "And then, Father, we will have to decide what kind of world we want to create. The objects hidden beneath Jerusalem have the power to transform human civilization. They could elevate us beyond our current limitations, grant us capabilities that would seem divine to the common people. But power like that comes with terrible responsibility. Not everyone in our brotherhood agrees on how or whether such power should be used." It was only later, much later, that Father Arnault would understand the true significance of that conversation, because Geoffroy de Saint-Omer wasn't just a companion to Hugues de Payens. He was something else entirely, a man with his own agenda, his own understanding of what the Templars should become. And he was about to become the 14th Knight, the shadow among brothers, the man whose betrayal would echo through the centuries. But in that moment, as winter darkness fell over Rennes-le-Château, Father Arnault simply handed over the documents that would change history. He never saw Geoffroy again, and he never learned that the man who had visited him that day would become the most dangerous secret the Knights Templar ever kept. 2 years later, when 9 knights officially formed the Order of the Poor Knights of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem, Geoffroy de Saint-Omer was listed among them. But there was another knight who wasn't listed, who stood in the shadows during that founding ceremony, whose name was never recorded in any public document. The chronicles say 9 knights began the order. The truth is there were 10 and 1 more who should never have been there at all. Jerusalem, 1118. The morning sun painted the limestone walls of the captured city in shades of gold and amber. But beneath the beauty lay the stench of war that still clung to every stone. In a small chamber within the Al-Aqsa Mosque, what the Crusaders now called the Temple of Solomon, 9 French knights gathered for a ceremony that would officially establish their order. But you need to understand something crucial. This wasn't the first time these men had met. This public founding was theater, a carefully staged performance for the benefit of King Baldwin II and the ecclesiastical authorities who needed to believe they understood what the Templars were really about. The truth was far more complex and infinitely more dangerous. 3 months earlier, in a cave outside the city walls where no prying eyes could witness, 10 men had gathered in secret. These were the true founders of what would become the Knights Templar, and their purpose went far beyond protecting pilgrims on dangerous roads. They had come to Jerusalem for one reason only: to find and recover the artifacts that Father Arnaud's documents had described. And leading them, guiding their mission with an intensity that bordered on obsession, was a man whose name would be deliberately omitted from every official record: Brother Bertrand de Blanchefort. Bertrand wasn't supposed to exist in Templar history. If you search the chronicles, you'll find that name appearing later, associated with the 6th Grand Master of the Order. But that was a different man, a descendant who took the same name to honor a legacy he could never fully understand. The original Bertrand de Blanchefort was there from the beginning, and his presence changed everything about what the Templars would become. Unlike the other 9 founders, who were all French nobles with ties to specific families and regions, Bertrand's background was shrouded in mystery. Some whispered he came from the Languedoc region, the same area where Father Arnaud had found his documents. Others claimed he had spent years in the East studying with Muslim scholars and Jewish mystics, learning languages and secrets that no Christian knight should know. But what everyone who met him agreed upon was this: Bertrand possessed knowledge that seemed impossible for any mortal man to have acquired through normal means. Picture him standing in that cave on that fateful night 3 months before the public founding. He was younger than most of the others, perhaps 30 years old, with dark hair and darker eyes that seemed to hold depths no one could fully fathom. When he spoke, even the most battle-hardened warriors found themselves listening with an attention they normally reserved for divine revelation. And what he told them that night would bind them together in ways that went far beyond the oaths they would later swear in public. "Brothers," Bertrand began, his voice carrying clearly in the enclosed space despite speaking barely above a normal tone, "you have been told that we come to Jerusalem to protect pilgrims. That is the story we will tell the world, and it must be told convincingly. But you know the truth. Beneath this city, in chambers that were sealed before Rome rose to power, lie objects that can reshape human consciousness itself. We are not here as guardians of the faithful. We are here as inheritors of a legacy that predates Christianity by millennia. Whose de Payens, who would become the public face of the order as its first Grand Master, shifted uncomfortably. He was a devout man, and even though he had been part of the planning that led to this moment, hearing their true purpose stated so baldly made his faith war with his curiosity. "Bertrand, we have committed ourselves to this mission because we believe these objects were blessed by God, used by Solomon in service of the divine will. Are you suggesting something different? Bertrand's expression softened slightly. I am suggesting, Brother Hugus, that our understanding of the divine may be more limited than we imagine. The objects we seek are tools, yes, but they are tools that bridge the gap between the physical and spiritual realms in ways that most theologians would consider impossible or heretical. King Solomon didn't receive his wisdom through revelation alone. He received it through mastery of these tools, technologies created by civilizations that understood consciousness and reality in ways we are only beginning to glimpse. Geoffroy de Saint-Omer, the man who had visited Father Arnaud 2 years earlier, spoke up. I have seen the documents. I have read descriptions that speak of objects that can grant sight beyond normal vision, that can allow communication across vast distances, that can heal injuries that should be mortal. If such things exist, we have a duty to recover them before they fall into other hands. But what hands would those be? Asked Payan de Montdidier, another of the founding knights. Who else knows of these objects? Who else seeks them? Bertrand's expression grew grave. That, brother, is a question that should trouble all of you. These documents that Father Arnaud found, do you think they are the only copies? Do you think we are the only ones who have been searching for these artifacts? There are others, organizations that have existed in secret for far longer than any Christian military order. Some serve the Islamic caliphates, others answer to authorities, even more ancient. And all of them understand that whoever controls these objects will control the future of human civilization. The weight of this revelation settled over the gathered knights like a physical presence. They had committed themselves to a quest, drawn by a mixture of religious devotion, curiosity, and the promise of power. But now they were beginning to understand the true scope of what they had undertaken. This wasn't just about recovering lost relics. This was about entering a secret war that had been raging for centuries, fought by forces most people didn't even know existed. André de Montbard, uncle to the future Bernard of Clairvaux, and a man whose scholarly nature made him naturally skeptical, posed a question that several others were thinking but hadn't dared to voice. How do you know all this, Bertrand? Where does your knowledge come from? What makes you so certain these objects exist and that we can find them? For a long moment, Bertrand didn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that made even these hardened warriors feel a chill run down their spines. Because, brothers, I have seen them. Not here, not in Jerusalem, but in other places, fragments that survived when they should have been lost forever. I have touched objects that allowed me to perceive realities beyond normal human consciousness. I have spoken with men and beings that appear as men who remember when these tools were commonplace, when human civilization operated at levels of sophistication we cannot imagine. That's impossible, Hugus protested. You speak of things that sound like heresy, like dealings with demons or forbidden magic. I speak of truth, Bertrand replied firmly, and the greatest heresy of all would be to let fear and ignorance keep us from understanding the full scope of God's creation. These objects were not made by demons, Hugus. They were made by human beings whose understanding of the divine exceeded our own. And if we are to fulfill our sacred duty, we must be willing to expand our understanding beyond the comfortable certainties of conventional faith. The debate that followed lasted through the night. Some of the knights argued for abandoning the entire venture, for returning to France and their ordinary lives. Others insisted they had come too far to turn back now. But in the end, all 10 men made the choice to continue, not because they fully understood or agreed with Bertrand's explanations, but because each of them, in their own way, had glimpsed the possibility of transcendence, the promise that human beings might be capable of more than they had ever imagined was too compelling to resist. But there was a price for Bertrand's knowledge and leadership. The price was secrecy. His existence had to be erased from the official record. When they made their public founding 3 months later, only 9 names would be recorded. Bertrand would work in the shadows, guiding their excavations beneath the Temple Mount, interpreting what they found, teaching them to use the artifacts they recovered. But he could never be acknowledged, never be celebrated, never take his rightful place among the Order's founders. Why? Because Bertrand carried a secret that was even more dangerous than their mission to recover ancient artifacts. A secret about his own origins, about where his knowledge truly came from. And if that secret were ever revealed, it would not just destroy the Knights Templar. It would shatter the foundations of the medieval world's understanding of reality itself, as the first light of dawn began to filter into the cave, casting long shadows across the faces of the 10 founders. Bertrand spoke one final time. We will succeed in our mission. We will find what was hidden. But understand this, the moment we touch those objects, the moment we begin to use them, we will change. We will become something more than we are now, but also something less than we should be. The line between enlightenment and damnation is far thinner than any theology admits, and we will all have to walk that line for the rest of our lives. 3 months later, when King Baldwin II formally recognized the Order of the Poor Knights of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, giving them quarters in the Al-Aqsa Mosque and permission to conduct their mission, the official history recorded 9 founders, but there were 10, and the 10th would become the most important of them, all not because of what he did for the Order, but because of what he would one day do to it. The betrayal hadn't happened yet. But in that cave outside Jerusalem, and the moment when Bertrand de Blanchefort revealed that he possessed knowledge no mortal should have, the seeds of that betrayal were already being planted. Because sometimes the greatest act of loyalty is knowing when to destroy what you love before it destroys everything else. For 9 years, the world believed the Knights Templar were living simple lives of devotion and service on the Temple Mount, protecting pilgrims and maintaining a modest presence in Jerusalem. But beneath the ancient stones, in tunnels that wound through layers of history like veins through living tissue, something extraordinary was taking place. The knights were digging, excavating with a precision and purpose that spoke of detailed knowledge about what lay hidden below, and guiding every stroke of their picks, every careful removal of ancient rubble, was Bertrand de Blanchefort, the 10th founder, who officially didn't exist. You need to understand the sheer audacity of what they were attempting. The Temple Mount wasn't just any archaeological site. It was and remains one of the most sacred locations in the world, holy to 3 major religions. Jewish tradition held that this was the site where Abraham prepared to sacrifice Isaac, where Solomon built his magnificent temple, where the Ark of the Covenant once resided. For Muslims, it was the place from which Muhammad ascended to heaven. and for Christians it was where Jesus had walked and taught. To dig beneath such ground without permission would have been considered sacrilege of the highest order. But the knights had permission. King Baldwin II, desperate for any help in defending his precarious kingdom, had granted them not just quarters in the Al-Aqsa Mosque, but implicit approval to do whatever they deemed necessary for their mission. What he didn't know was that protecting pilgrims was merely cover for an excavation operation that would span nearly a decade. The work began in earnest during the winter of 1119, while most of the knights maintained their public duties above ground. Rotating shifts ensured that excavation continued around the clock. Bertrand had studied Father Arnaud's documents with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Cross-referencing them with other sources, he claimed to have access to sources he refused to name or describe in detail. The result was a map of the subterranean structure beneath the Temple Mount that proved to be disturbingly accurate. They found the first chamber 3 months into their excavation. It was a small room, barely 10 feet square, carved from the living rock with a precision that spoke of advanced tools and sophisticated understanding of stonework. The walls were covered in inscriptions, not Hebrew, as they might have expected, but something far older. The script resembled Egyptian hieroglyphs, but with subtle differences that suggested either great antiquity or deliberate modification. Bertrand spent 3 days alone in that chamber, studying the inscriptions by torchlight, refusing food, and barely accepting water. When he finally emerged, his face was transformed. Those who saw him said his eyes burned with an inner fire that hadn't been there before, as if he had looked upon something that mere mortals weren't meant to see. "This is only the beginning," he told the assembled knights. "These inscriptions describe a network of chambers, a complex system designed to preserve knowledge and objects of power. But there's something else. These aren't instructions left by Solomon's builders. These predate the Jewish temple by centuries. Whatever was hidden here was placed by an earlier civilization, one that the builders of Solomon's temple discovered and tried to understand." André de Montbard, whose scholarly nature made him perpetually skeptical, examined the inscriptions himself. His knowledge of ancient languages was considerable, but what he saw on those walls challenged everything he thought he understood about history. "This is impossible," he muttered. The precision of the carving, the sophistication of the concepts being expressed, nothing like this should exist from that period. It's as if whoever made this had knowledge we've only recently begun to rediscover." "Not rediscover," Bertrand corrected quietly. "Remember, knowledge doesn't progress in a straight line. Civilizations rise and fall. What we think of as progress might be nothing more than stumbling back toward understanding that was once commonplace and then lost." The debate that followed revealed growing tensions within the group. Some knights, led by Hugues de Payens, wanted to report their findings to ecclesiastical authorities, to seek guidance from those they believed were qualified to interpret such discoveries. Others, particularly Geoffroy de Saint-Omer, argued that secrecy was paramount, that revealing what they had found would invite intervention from forces that might not share their goals. But it was Bertrand who settled the matter, with words that would echo through the Order's history. "We have passed the point of turning back. The moment we set pick to stone, we committed ourselves to seeing this through to the end. Whatever we find down here, whatever truths we uncover, they belong to us now. We are the inheritors of this legacy, for better or worse. And we will decide not kings, not bishops, not popes, what to do with what we discover. The excavation continued, following the directions gleaned from the inscriptions. In that first chamber, they dug deeper, moving through layers of construction and destruction that told the story of Jerusalem's tumultuous history. They passed through Roman foundations, found coins and pottery from the time of Herod, discovered evidence of the Babylonian destruction, and finally broke through into something that predated all of it. The great chamber revealed itself during the summer of 1122. It was vast, easily 60 feet long and 40 feet wide, with a vaulted ceiling that rose 20 feet above the floor. Unlike the rough-hewn tunnels they had been excavating through, this space showed signs of intentional design and careful construction. The walls were smooth, covered in more of the mysterious inscriptions, but also with images bas-reliefs that depicted scenes unlike anything in biblical history. One relief showed figures that appeared almost human, but with elongated heads and strange proportions, standing before a massive structure that looked nothing like Solomon's temple. Another depicted what could only be described as celestial phenomena, stars and planets arranged in patterns that suggested sophisticated astronomical knowledge. A third showed what appeared to be a ritual or ceremony, with figures holding objects that emanated rays of light or energy. But it was what stood in the center of the chamber that stopped every knight in their tracks. On a raised platform, carved from a single piece of stone, sat a series of pedestals. Most were empty, but 3 still held objects that gleamed in the torchlight, with a luster that seemed wrong somehow. As if they were reflecting light that wasn't there, Bertrand approached slowly, almost reverently. "Don't touch anything," he commanded. "Not yet. We need to understand what we're looking at before we disturb anything." For 3 days they studied the chamber and its contents without touching the objects on the pedestals. Bertrand translated what he could of the inscriptions, though he admitted that much of the language remained mysterious even to him. What he was able to determine painted a picture that both thrilled and terrified the assembled knights. These objects were tools, devices created by a civilization that had mastered what they called the sacred sciences, an integration of what we would now call physics, consciousness studies, and spiritual understanding. They weren't magic in any supernatural sense, but they operated according to principles that the knights' medieval understanding of the world couldn't adequately explain. The first object appeared to be a crown or circlet, made of a metal that looked like gold but felt wrong to the touch, heavier than gold should be, and warmer as if it generated its own heat. Inscriptions around its base described it as a vessel of knowing, something that could expand the wearer's consciousness to perceive realities beyond normal human awareness. The second was a staff or rod, approximately 3 feet long, covered in intricate geometric patterns that seemed to shift and change depending on the angle from which they were viewed. The inscriptions called it a key of opening, suggesting it could unlock not just physical barriers, but also barriers between states of existence. The third object was the most disturbing, a smooth, black stone roughly the size of a human heart, polished to such a perfect finish that looking into its depths created a sensation of falling. The inscriptions offered no name for this object, only a warning. To know without wisdom is to invite dissolution. Let only the prepared approach the mirror of truth. It was Felipe de Bordeaux who first broke the unspoken agreement not to touch the objects. He was young, barely 25, and he had spent the previous night translating a section of inscription that he was convinced promised revelations about the nature of time itself. Before anyone could stop him, he reached out and grasped the black stone. What happened next would haunt the Knights for the rest of their lives. Felipe didn't scream or collapse. Instead, he simply froze, his hand locked around the stone, his eyes wide and unblinking. For what seemed like an eternity, but was probably only seconds, he stood perfectly still. Then he began to speak, but not in any language the Knights recognized. The words flowed from him in a torrent, an ancient tongue that predated Hebrew, Greek, or Latin. Bertrand was the only one who seemed to understand what Felipe was saying. His face grew pale as he listened, and when Felipe finally released the stone and collapsed to the floor, Bertrand's hands were shaking. "He saw," Bertrand whispered. "He saw what this place really is, what these objects really do. And he saw what we're going to become if we continue down this path." Felipe recovered, but he was changed. Those who looked into his eyes said they could see echoes of something vast and terrible, as if he had glimpsed realities that human minds weren't designed to comprehend. He would never speak of what he had seen in detail, but in fragments and whispered confessions during moments of weakness. He revealed pieces of a truth that terrified everyone who heard it. The objects weren't left by a vanished civilization. They were placed there deliberately, set as a test or perhaps a trap. Whoever recovered them would gain access to knowledge and power beyond imagining. But that knowledge came with a price. The loss of certainty, the destruction of comfortable beliefs, and the terrible burden of understanding just how fragile and contingent human existence really was. "We should seal this chamber," Hugues de Payens urged after Felipe's experience. "Whatever these objects are, they're too dangerous for mortal men to wield. We should wall them up again and forget we ever found them." But Bertrand shook his head slowly. "It's too late for that, Hugues." The moment Felipe touched that stone, something was set in motion. These objects are waking up, responding to human contact after centuries of dormancy. If we try to seal them away now, we'll only be postponing the inevitable. Someone else will find them eventually. And when they do, they won't have the preparation we've had, the warnings we've received. They'll use these tools blindly, without understanding the consequences. "Then what do you propose?" André de Montbard demanded. "We take them," Bertrand replied. "We study them. We learn to use them safely. And we establish protocols, safeguards, to ensure that this knowledge and power is never misused. We become the guardians not just of these physical objects, but of the wisdom necessary to wield them responsibly." It was Geoffroy de Saint-Omer who asked the question everyone else was thinking, but feared to voice. "And if we fail? If we can't control them? If the power corrupts us, as it has corrupted so many before?" Bertrand's expression was grave as he answered, "Then we will have to find someone strong enough to stop us. Someone who understands what we possess, but is willing to destroy it all rather than let it destroy the world. We will need a betrayer, someone who can do what must be done when the time comes." At the time, everyone assumed Bertrand was speaking hypothetically, planning for a contingency that would never arise. None of them realized that Bertrand was describing himself, that he was already making preparations for the ultimate act of betrayal that would one day bring the Knights Templar crashing down. Because sometimes the greatest loyalty requires the willingness to destroy everything you've built to save what matters most. The year was 1125, and the Knights Templar had been operating in Jerusalem for 7 years. To the outside world, they remained a small, devoted group of warrior monks, barely a dozen men who had taken vows of poverty and service. But beneath the Temple Mount, they had assembled a collection of artifacts that would have shocked the medieval world into disbelief. And more importantly, they had learned to use them, with consequences that were beginning to manifest in disturbing ways. You see, the objects they had discovered weren't passive relics. They were interactive technologies that responded to human consciousness, amplifying certain abilities while fundamentally altering the mental and spiritual structure of those who used them regularly. The knights who had spent years in contact with these artifacts were no longer quite human in the conventional sense. They could perceive thoughts at a distance, see events unfolding hundreds of miles away, and manipulate probability itself through focused intention. But this power came at a terrible price. Several knights had experienced what they euphemistically called dissolution, a state where individual identity began to fragment, merging with the vast consciousness that seemed to underlie the artifacts themselves. Philippe de Bordeaux, who had been the first to touch the black stone, never fully recovered his sense of separate selfhood. He would often speak as if he were multiple people simultaneously, referring to himself as we rather than I, describing experiences from perspectives that couldn't possibly be his own. It was into this increasingly unstable situation that the 14th night arrived. His name was Marcus Keller, and unlike every other member of the order, he wasn't French. He wasn't even a nobleman. He was a German commoner, the son of a merchant family from Bavaria, and he had absolutely no business being in Jerusalem at all, much less seeking admission to an exclusive military order that drew its members exclusively from French nobility. But Marcus Keller possessed something that made all conventional barriers irrelevant. He had seen the future. The vision had come to him 3 years earlier, in 1122. At the exact moment Philippe de Bordeaux had touched the black stone in the chamber beneath Jerusalem. Marcus had been in Munich at the time, working in his father's counting house, when suddenly reality shattered around him like glass. For what seemed like hours but was probably only seconds, he experienced a cascade of images and sensations that defied rational explanation. He saw the Knights Templar as they really were, working in tunnels beneath Jerusalem with objects that glowed with their own inner light. He saw Bertrand de Blanchefort, a man he had never met and whose name he had never heard, holding what looked like a crown while his eyes blazed with supernatural awareness. And most disturbingly, he saw the future, not just days or months ahead, but decades, even centuries. He saw the Templars rise to unimaginable power, and then fall in a single night of coordinated arrests. He saw their treasures scattered and hidden, their knowledge fragmented and lost. And he saw himself standing in that chamber beneath Jerusalem, making a choice that would determine whether humanity survived what was coming. When the vision released him, Marcus was lying on the floor of the counting house, his nose bleeding and his hand shaking. His father found him there, convinced his son had suffered some kind of seizure. But Marcus knew better. Whatever had happened, it wasn't a medical event. It was a message, a calling, an invitation, or perhaps a warning from forces that operated beyond normal causality. It took him 3 years to make his way to Jerusalem. 3 years of selling everything he owned, learning to fight, studying languages and history, and following intuitions that seemed to come from somewhere outside his own mind. By the time he arrived at the gates of the city in the spring of 1125, he had transformed himself from a merchant's son into something that might pass for a knight if you didn't look too closely at his pedigree or question his story too carefully. Bertrand de Blanchefort recognized him instantly when Marcus presented himself at the Templar compound, asking to speak with whoever led the order. The guards dismissed him as just another pilgrim with delusions of grandeur. But before they could turn him away, Bertrand emerged from the entrance to the underground chambers, his eyes locking onto Marcus with an intensity that made the guards take an involuntary step backward. "Let him pass," Bertrand commanded. "This man is expected." The private meeting between Bertrand and Marcus lasted 3 hours, and what transpired during that time would only become clear much later. But when they emerged, Bertrand called an emergency council of all 10 founding knights. What he told them would fracture the order in ways that would never fully heal. "Brothers," Bertrand began, his voice carrying the weight of terrible knowledge, "we have been working under false assumptions. We believed we were the first to discover these artifacts in our generation, that we were pioneers exploring unknown territory. But we were wrong. The objects we found were left for us deliberately. We were meant to find them, meant to use them, meant to become what we have become. We are not explorers. We are subjects in an experiment that has been running for thousands of years." The assembled knights erupted in protests and questions, but Bertrand raised his hand for silence. "This man," he gestured to Marcus, "has been touched by the same forces we have been manipulating. But unlike us, he received something we did not, a warning. 3 years ago, at the exact moment Felipe touched the black stone, a psychic shockwave rippled across reality itself. This man, thousands of miles away, was struck by that wave, and in that moment he saw what we are too close to perceive, the true purpose of these artifacts and the catastrophe that awaits us if we continue on our current path." Hugues de Payen stood, his face flushed with anger. "This is madness, Bertrand. We cannot make decisions based on the fevered visions of a stranger, a commoner who has no business being here at all. How do we know he isn't a spy, sent by our enemies to sow discord among us?" But it was André de Montbard who asked the crucial question. "What did you see, Marcus Keller? What future awaits us?" Marcus spoke for the first time since entering the chamber, his voice quiet but carrying a certainty that was impossible to dismiss. "I saw your order grow beyond anything you can imagine. I saw you become the wealthiest and most powerful organization in Europe, with commanderies from Scotland to the Holy Land, with influence that made kings tremble. I saw you accumulating knowledge and artifacts that gave you capabilities that seemed godlike to ordinary men." He paused, and when he continued, his voice was heavy with sorrow. "And then I saw you destroyed, not by external enemies, though they will be the instruments of your fall, but by your own success, by the corruption that comes from possessing power that no mortal should wield. I saw knights who began with noble intentions, transformed into something that barely remembered their humanity. I saw the artifacts consuming your consciousness until there was nothing left of the men you once were. And I saw the final betrayal, the moment when one of you realizes that the only way to save humanity from what you have become is to destroy the order completely. The chamber fell silent. Every knight present knew, on some level, that Marcus was speaking truth. They had all felt themselves changing, felt their humanity slipping away as they integrated more deeply with the artifacts. But hearing it stated so boldly, hearing the end point of their trajectory described with such clarity, made it impossible to ignore any longer. "Why are you here?" Geoffroy de Saint-Omer demanded. "If you've seen our destruction, why not simply stay away? Why insert yourself into this doomed enterprise?" Marcus's expression was grim, because in every future I saw, in every timeline that branched from this moment, there was one constant: the Templars fall. There is no version of reality where your order survives unchanged. But there are differences in how you fall, and those differences matter. In some futures, your destruction is so complete that all the knowledge you've gathered is lost forever, and humanity staggers on in ignorance for centuries. In others, fragments of your wisdom survive, scattered and hidden, waiting for a time when humans are ready to wield such power responsibly. He took a deep breath before continuing. "I am here because I saw myself here. In the futures where your knowledge survives, where something good comes from your sacrifice, I am always present. I am the 14th Knight, the outsider who doesn't belong, but who must be here nonetheless. I am the bridge between your secret history and the world that will come after you fall. And I am the one who will remember what you really were, beneath the myths and legends that will grow around your memory." Bertrand nodded slowly, as if Marcus had confirmed something he had long suspected. "Brothers, I propose we admit this man into our order, despite every rule and tradition that says we shouldn't. Not because his vision guarantees success, it doesn't, but because refusing to accept him guarantees failure. The timeline where we survive with our knowledge intact requires his presence. Without him, we face either total annihilation or transformation into something so inhuman that destroying us becomes a moral imperative." The debate that followed was fierce and lasted well into the night. Some knights argued that accepting a commoner, a foreigner, violated the very foundations of their order. Others pointed out that they had already violated far more fundamental rules by working with artifacts that the Church would condemn as demonic. In the end, it was Philippe de Bordeaux who settled the matter, speaking in the strange multiple voice that had become his norm. "We who have touched the stone know that time is not a line but a fabric, and this man is a thread woven into our pattern. To remove him would unravel everything. He is meant to be here, just as we are meant to fall. The question is not whether to accept him, but whether we have the courage to embrace our destiny, knowing how it ends." And so Marcus Keller became the 14th Knight, though his membership would never be officially recorded. He didn't take the same vows as the others, didn't swear the same oaths, and never fully integrated into the Order's public face. He existed in a space between insider and outsider, trusted by some, suspected by others. but recognized by all as someone who played by different rules because he served a different purpose. What none of them understood at the time was that Marcus was not there to save the Knights Templar. He was there to ensure that when they fell, when they had to fall, something worth saving would survive the collapse. He was the archive, the witness, the keeper of secrets who would endure beyond their destruction. And in the shadows, Bertrand de Blanchefort watched Marcus with an expression that mixed relief and sorrow, because Bertrand had known for years that someone would have to betray the Order to save humanity from what they were becoming. He had assumed that burden would fall on him. But perhaps with Marcus's arrival there was another way. Perhaps the 14th Knight could carry out the necessary betrayal, leaving Bertrand free to remain loyal to the end. It would take decades for that hope to reveal itself as the delusion it was, because in the end it wouldn't be Marcus who betrayed the Templars. It would be Bertrand himself making choices that would echo through history as either the greatest treachery or the greatest sacrifice the medieval world had ever known. The decade that followed Marcus Keller's admission into the secret, Brotherhood saw the Knights Templar transform from a small group of warrior monks into an organization that wielded influence across the known world. Pope Honorius II granted them formal recognition in 1129, giving them privileges that no other religious order enjoyed. Bernard of Clairvaux, André de Montbard's nephew, became their greatest advocate, writing their rule and championing their cause throughout Europe. Donations poured in from nobles and commoners alike. Land, castles, wealth all flowed toward the Order with a speed that would have seemed miraculous if you didn't understand the truth. The artifacts were working, not in the crude, obvious ways that medieval minds expected from magic or divine intervention, but through subtle manipulation of probability and perception. Knights who wore the crown artifact found that negotiations always seemed to go their way, that people trusted them instinctively, that doors opened before them as if by providence. Those who carried the staff discovered that their strategic insights bordered on prescient, that they could sense danger before it manifested, that their military campaigns succeeded with uncanny regularity, but it was the black stone that granted the most disturbing capabilities. The few knights who had been deemed stable enough to work with it regularly reported abilities that transcended normal human consciousness entirely. They could project their awareness across vast distances, perceiving events happening in real time hundreds of miles away. They could sense the thoughts and emotions of others with uncomfortable clarity. And most troubling of all, they could influence those thoughts and emotions, planting suggestions that felt like the target's own ideas. By 1135, the Order had grown to include over 300 knights, with support staff and affiliated members numbering in the thousands. But the inner circle, those who knew about the artifacts and had been trained to use them, remained small. Fewer than 20 men had been given access to the chamber beneath Jerusalem, and of those only a handful used the objects regularly. The rest of the Order operated in ignorance of the true source of their success, attributing their rapid rise to divine favor and superior organization. Marcus Keller watched this transformation with growing alarm. The visions that had driven him to Jerusalem continued, becoming more frequent and more detailed as the years passed. He saw timelines branching and converging, possibilities collapsing into actualities, and in every future he perceived. The same pattern repeated. The Templars would continue to accumulate power until they became something that could no longer be permitted to exist. The only variables were the timing of their fall and what survived afterward. But there was something else Marcus saw in his visions, something he hadn't told the other knights because he himself didn't fully understand it. In every timeline there was a shadow, a presence that seemed to exist outside normal causality. Sometimes it appeared as a person, sometimes as a symbol or a whisper, but it was always there, watching, waiting, guiding events toward an outcome that Marcus couldn't quite perceive. He began to suspect that the experiment Bertrand had spoken of wasn't being conducted by long-dead civilizations. It was ongoing, directed by an intelligence that existed across time rather than within it. The artifacts weren't just tools left behind. They were bait, carefully designed to attract and test consciousness that had evolved enough to use them. And humanity was failing that test spectacularly. It was during the summer of 1136 that the first signs of serious trouble emerged. Brother Guillaume de Montfort, one of the knights who had been working extensively with the Black Stone, began experiencing what could only be described as a complete dissolution of personal identity. He would wake up claiming to be other people, sometimes historical figures long dead, sometimes individuals he had never met, but whose thoughts he could somehow access through the stones. Influenced at the breaking point came during a council meeting when Guillaume suddenly began speaking in ancient Egyptian, describing events from the construction of the pyramids as if he had witnessed them personally. When the episode passed, he collapsed, and when he recovered consciousness hours later, he couldn't remember his own name. The man called Guillaume de Montfort was gone, replaced by a fragmented collection of memories and personalities that had no coherent center. Bertrand ordered the immediate cessation of all work with the Black Stone, but the damage was done. 2 other knights who had been in regular contact with the artifact began showing similar symptoms. It became clear that the objects weren't just tools that could be mastered through discipline and training. They were vectors for something else, channels through which alien consciousness could flow into human minds, overriding individual identity with something vast and incomprehensible. An emergency council convened in the deepest chamber beneath Jerusalem, with only the original 10 founders and Marcus present. The mood was grim as Bertrand laid out the situation with brutal honesty. "We have been fools," he began, his face haggard with exhaustion and something that looked like despair. "We thought we could control these artifacts, use them for our purposes while maintaining our humanity. But we were wrong. The objects are using us, transforming us into something we never intended to become. Guillaume is lost, and he won't be the last. If we continue on this path, every knight who touches these artifacts will eventually suffer the same fate." Hugues de Payens, now officially recognized as Grand Master of the Order, looked around the circle of faces. "Then we seal the chamber. We wall up the artifacts and never touch them again. We continue our public mission without relying on their power." But André de Montbard shook his head. "It's too late for that, Hugues. We've already been exposed. The changes have already begun in all of us. Look at Bertrand. Can you honestly say he's the same man who led us into this chamber 14 years ago? Look at Felipe, at Geoffroy, at yourself. We've all been altered by contact with these objects. Sealing them away won't reverse what's already happened. Marcus spoke up for the first time, his voice quiet but carrying authority that none of the original founders possessed. There's another problem. The artifacts are becoming more active. I can feel them in my visions, sense them reaching out, trying to make contact with other sources of power. If we simply abandon them, they'll attract attention from forces we can't control. There are others who seek these objects, organizations that have been searching for centuries. Our presence here, our use of the artifacts has been like a beacon. We've announced to everyone watching that these tools exist and can be accessed. Then what do you propose? Geoffroy de Saint-Omer demanded. We can't use them without losing ourselves, and we can't abandon them without inviting disaster. Are we simply trapped, doomed to slowly dissolve into whatever alien consciousness inhabits these objects? It was Bertrand who answered, and his words would set in motion events that would culminate nearly 2 centuries later in the Order's destruction. We divide the artifacts. We scatter them to different locations, places so remote and so well hidden that they'll never be found together again. We establish separate commanderies, each one guarding a single object, with protocols so strict that no one knight can ever access more than one artifact at a time. And we establish a new inner circle, a group within the group, whose sole purpose is to ensure that if the artifacts ever begin to corrupt us beyond redemption, they have the authority and the means to destroy everything we've built. The proposal was radical, but everyone present understood its necessity. Over the following months, the artifacts were carefully transported out of Jerusalem to locations that would remain secret even from most members of the Order. The crown went to a commandery in Scotland. The staff was hidden in the Pyrenees. The black stone was sealed in a chamber beneath the Paris temple, where it could be monitored but never again touched directly. But there were other artifacts as well, objects they had discovered during their years of excavation that hadn't been mentioned in Father Arnault's original documents. Smaller pieces, fragments of the larger technology, each one potentially dangerous but individually less overwhelming than the 3 primary objects. These were distributed across Europe, creating a network of hidden repositories that only the inner circle knew about, and Marcus Keller was given a unique role. He would be the keeper of maps, the one person who knew the location of every hidden artifact. But the knowledge was encoded in a way that required special keys to decode, keys that were themselves distributed among trusted members of the inner circle. No single person, not even Marcus, could access all the artifacts without cooperation from others. It was a system designed to prevent exactly the kind of concentrated power that had nearly destroyed them. But systems, no matter how carefully designed, can be circumvented by those who understand their weaknesses. And there was someone among the knights who had been planning for exactly this moment. Someone who had foreseen the necessity of scattering the artifacts and had been quietly positioning himself to exploit that dispersion. His name was Gerard de Villers, and he had joined the Order in 1130, 5 years after Marcus's arrival. Unlike the original founders, Gerard had never been motivated by religious devotion or curiosity about ancient mysteries. He was a practical man, a merchant soul trapped in a knight's body, and he recognized immediately that the Templars were sitting on a source of power that could reshape the medieval world if that power could be properly controlled and deployed. Ge Acute RARD had spent 6 years studying the inner workings of the order, identifying who had real authority, who knew which secrets, and most importantly, how decisions were actually made beneath the public facade of religious devotion. He had never been allowed into the deepest chambers, had never touched the artifacts directly, but he had pieced together enough information to understand what the order really possessed. And now, as the artifacts were being scattered across Europe, Gerard saw an opportunity. If he could gain access to even one of these objects, if he could learn to use it without suffering the identity dissolution that had destroyed Guillaume de Montfort, he could leverage that power into a position of true authority within the order. And from there, who knew what might be possible? But Gerard de Villers wasn't the betrayer that history would remember. He was merely ambitious, willing to bend rules and manipulate systems to serve his goals. The true betrayal would come from somewhere else, from someone whose motivations went far deeper than mere personal ambition, because Bertrand de Blanchefort had been planning his own betrayal since the moment he first touched one of the artifacts. And that betrayal wouldn't be about gaining power. It would be about destroying it utterly, ensuring that the knowledge the Templars had gathered would never be used to enslave humanity to forces beyond mortal comprehension. The 14th Knight, Marcus Keller, suspected some of this. His visions showed him fragments of the coming betrayal, glimpses of a plan so audacious and so necessary that it could only have been conceived by someone who loved the order enough to destroy it. But what Marcus didn't know, what no one except Bertrand himself knew, was that the betrayal had already begun. 20 years passed, and the Knights Templar reached heights of power that would have seemed impossible during their humble beginnings. By 1156, they controlled a vast network of commanderies stretching from Scotland to the Holy Land, operated the most sophisticated banking system in Europe, and wielded influence that made kings nervous and popes dependent. But beneath this public success, the inner circle struggled with a problem that grew worse with each passing year. The artifacts were still changing them, still pulling at the threads of their humanity, still whispering promises of transcendence that came at a price no mortal should pay. Bertrand de Blanchefort had aged, but not in the way normal men aged. He was now in his late 60s, yet he moved with the vitality of a man half his age. His eyes had taken on a quality that made people uncomfortable, not threatening, exactly, but too knowing, as if he saw through surfaces into depths that ordinary perception couldn't reach. Those who spent time with him reported dreams afterward, vivid and disturbing visions that seemed to come from outside their own minds. He had maintained sporadic contact with the Crown artifact despite the protocols designed to limit exposure. Not enough to trigger the kind of complete dissolution that had destroyed Guillaume de Montfort, but enough to keep himself connected to the network of consciousness that the artifacts represented. And through that connection, Bertrand had learned something that changed everything. The experiment wasn't just about humanity. It was about something far larger and far more terrifying. The artifacts were nodes in a vast system that stretched across time and space, connecting civilizations separated by millennia and light years. Whoever created them and Bertrand was no longer certain they had been created by any single species or civilization had designed them as a kind of test. Species that developed consciousness, sophisticated enough to use the artifacts, were given a choice: integrate with the larger network and transcend individual existence, or reject the integration and remain limited but free. Most species, Bertrand had learned, chose integration. The promise of unlimited knowledge, of consciousness that spanned galaxies and epochs, was too compelling to resist. But integration came at a cost: the complete dissolution of individual identity, the absorption of entire civilizations into a collective consciousness that thought in time frames measured in eons and operated according to goals that individual beings could never comprehend. Humanity was being offered that same choice, and the Knights Templar, through their possession and use of the artifacts, were inadvertently accepting the offer on behalf of the entire species. This was the knowledge that had driven Bertrand to begin planning his betrayal decades earlier. This was why he had insisted on scattering the artifacts, on establishing protocols that limited exposure, on creating systems that could destroy everything if the corruption went too far. Because he had seen the endpoint of integration, had touched the edges of that vast collective consciousness, and had recognized it for what it was: not enlightenment, but extinction. The end of humanity as a species of distinct, individual beings. But Bertrand's planning had been complicated by the emergence of a true conspiracy within the Order, not the necessary safeguards of the inner circle, but an actual plot to seize control of all the artifacts and use them for purposes that even Bertrand found disturbing. Gerard de Villers had spent 26 years building his power base within the Templars. He had never achieved admission to the innermost circle, had never been given access to the artifacts themselves, but he had done something perhaps more dangerous. He had built a network of loyal followers who believed in his vision of what the Order should become. Gerard's philosophy was simple and seductive. If the artifacts granted power, then that power should be used. The dissolution that had destroyed Guillaume and others wasn't a warning to retreat. It was simply a technical problem to be solved. With proper discipline and training, with systematic study rather than mystical reverence, the artifacts could be mastered. And once mastered, they could be deployed to reshape medieval civilization according to rational principles, rather than the chaos of feudal warfare and religious superstition. He envisioned a Europe united under Templar guidance, with the artifacts providing the capabilities necessary to enforce peace, promote prosperity, and advance human knowledge at a pace that would have taken centuries under normal circumstances. It was, in his view, humanity's best chance to transcend the limitations that had kept civilization trapped in cycles of violence and ignorance. What Gerard didn't understand, what his rational mind couldn't quite grasp, was that the artifacts weren't neutral tools waiting to be mastered. They were active agents in their own right, shaping those who used them toward purposes that served the larger network's agenda. Every rational argument for using the artifacts more extensively was itself a product of their influence, a thought carefully planted to encourage exactly the kind of integration that Bertrand had recognized as existential threat. By 1160. Gerard had identified the locations of 3 artifacts: the staff hidden in the Pyrenees, a smaller fragment housed in a commandery near Lyon, and most importantly, the black stone that remained sealed beneath the Paris temple. He had spent years cultivating relationships with the knights who guarded these locations, gradually positioning his own followers in key positions. He was now within months of having simultaneous access to multiple artifacts, something the protocols were specifically designed to prevent. Marcus Keller saw all of this in his visions, watched the conspiracy unfold across multiple timelines. But what troubled him most wasn't Gerard's plot that could be stopped with warning and intervention. What troubled him was that in every timeline where Gerard was prevented from seizing the artifacts, something worse happened. The conspiracy itself seemed to serve a purpose in the larger pattern, as if the universe needed Gerard to push events toward a crisis point that would otherwise take decades longer to reach. Marcus had spent 35 years among the Templars, aging from a young merchant's son into a weathered warrior whose visions had only grown stronger and more frequent. He had become in many ways more important to the Order's functioning than many of the original founders. His ability to perceive probability streams made him invaluable for strategic planning, and his role as keeper of the artifact maps gave him a unique position that transcended normal hierarchy. But Marcus had also seen something in his recent visions that filled him with dread: his own death, coming soon, occurring in dozens of different ways across divergent timelines. And more disturbing still, he had seen that his death was necessary, that it somehow catalyzed events that needed to happen for humanity to survive the coming crisis. During a private meeting in early 1161, Marcus shared these visions with Bertrand. The two men had developed a relationship over the decades that transcended the normal bonds of brotherhood. They were co-conspirators in the truest sense, both working toward the same impossible goal: saving humanity from forces that most people didn't know existed. "I've seen my death," Marcus said without preamble. "Not just once, but hundreds of times, across every timeline that branches from this moment. Sometimes Gerard kills me when I discover his plot. Sometimes I die in an accident that isn't really an accident. Sometimes illness, sometimes violence from unexpected quarters. But always soon, always within the year." Bertrand's expression didn't change, but Marcus could sense the grief beneath his controlled facade. "And you believe these deaths are necessary? That they serve some larger purpose?" "I believe," Marcus replied slowly, "that my role was to be the bridge to connect the founding of the Order with its destruction. I brought information from outside that helped you understand the true nature of the artifacts. I've served as keeper of maps, as strategic advisor, as the voice of possibility speaking truth that others found uncomfortable. But now my presence has become an obstacle. As long as I live, certain timelines remain open that need to close. My death simplifies the equation, forces choices that need to be made." "What choices?" Bertrand asked, though Marcus suspected he already knew the answer. "The choice of betrayal," Marcus said. "As long as I'm alive, people assume I'll be the one to carry out the necessary destruction. I'm the outsider, the 14th knight who never quite belonged. If betrayal comes from me, it's almost expected. But if betrayal comes from you, from one of the founding brothers, from someone who has been central to the Order from its beginning, the impact will be far greater. The shock will ensure that what needs to be destroyed stays destroyed." Bertrand closed his eyes, and for a moment he looked every year of his age, plus the weight of decades spent carrying impossible knowledge. I had hoped there might be another way. There never was, Marcus said gently. You've known that since the beginning, since the moment you first touched the crown and saw what we would have to become to stop what's coming. The artifacts must be scattered beyond recovery. The order must fall so completely that no one can reconstitute it. And that fall must be orchestrated by someone who understands both the necessity and the cost. Gerard's conspiracy, Bertrand said slowly. You're saying I should let it proceed? I'm saying it's already proceeding, and trying to stop it only delays the inevitable. Let Gerard get close to the artifacts. Let him taste the power he thinks he can control. And when he's committed, when there's no pulling back, then reveal the trap. Let the world see what happens when the artifacts corrupt even the best intentions. Let them see why the Templars cannot be allowed to continue. Marcus paused, then added the hardest truth of all. And let them see a founder one of the original 10 choose destruction over corruption. Let that choice echo through history as the moment when humanity rejected integration in favor of remaining human, regardless of the cost. The two men sat in silence for a long time after that, both contemplating futures that held no comfort, but might, if they were very lucky and very brave, contain salvation for a species that didn't even know it needed saving. In the shadows beyond their conversation, forces older than human civilization watched and waited. The experiment was approaching its critical phase. Soon they would know whether this particular species would join the network or remain stubbornly, dangerously individual. Either outcome was acceptable. But the process of choice, the moment when a civilization stood at the crossroads and decided its own fate, that was what made the entire experiment worthwhile. Marcus Keller died on a cold November night in 1161, in a manner that was both exactly as he had foreseen and entirely unexpected. He was alone in his chamber within the Paris temple, working by candlelight on encrypted maps that showed the locations of artifacts scattered across Europe. The official record would state that he died of natural causes, a sudden failure of the heart common in men of his age. But those who found his body knew better. His face bore an expression of transcendent peace, as if he had witnessed something beautiful beyond mortal comprehension in his final moments. And clutched in his left hand was a fragment of parchment bearing a single sentence written in his own hand. The bridge is complete. What comes next belongs to others. You need to understand what Marcus's death truly meant. For 36 years he had served as a living anchor, a fixed point that kept certain timelines open and others closed. His unique ability to perceive probability streams had made him invaluable, but it had also made him a constraint on possibility. As long as Marcus lived, the future remained partially visible, predictable, manageable. His death was like cutting a rope that had been holding back a flood. Suddenly, timelines that had seemed impossible became probable. Events that should have taken decades compressed into months. Bertrand de Blanchefort was the first to reach Marcus's chamber after his death was discovered. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, looking at the peaceful face of the man who had been his closest confidant for more than 3 decades. Then he carefully removed the parchment from Marcus's hand, read it once, and burned it in the candle flame before anyone else could see what it said. At Marcus's funeral, attended only by the inner circle who knew his true importance, Bertrand delivered a eulogy that would be remembered by those present for the rest of their lives. Brother Marcus came to us from outside, bringing warnings we didn't want to hear and truths we couldn't deny. He showed us futures we hoped to avoid and helped us understand that sometimes the only way forward is through catastrophe. He was the 14th Knight, the one who shouldn't have existed but whose presence made all the difference. And now his work is done, leaving us to complete what he began. What Bertrand didn't say, what he couldn't say even to the inner circle, was that Marcus's death had removed the last obstacle to his own plans. Plans that had been forming for decades, waiting for the right moment to be executed. Within days of Marcus's death, Gerard de Villers made his move. With the keeper of maps gone and the inner circle distracted by grief, he saw an opportunity that might never come again. Using his network of loyal followers, he orchestrated simultaneous raids on 3 locations: the commandery in the Pyrenees where the staff was hidden, the facility near Lyon that housed a smaller artifact, and most audaciously, the sealed chamber beneath the Paris temple, itself where the black stone waited. The operations were executed with military precision. Gerard's men overwhelmed the guards, seized the artifacts, and brought them to a location. Gerard had prepared months earlier a remote castle in the Alps, where he could study the objects without interference from the official hierarchy, but Gerard had made a critical miscalculation. He believed that with Marcus dead, there was no one left who could track the artifacts' locations or coordinate a response. He didn't know that Bertrand had been planning for exactly this scenario, that Marcus's maps had been copies of copies, and that the true master records existed only in Bertrand's memory enhanced by decades of exposure to the crown artifact. More importantly, Gerard didn't understand that Bertrand wanted him to succeed in seizing the artifacts. The conspiracy, the theft, the audacious violation of every protocol, these were necessary steps in a much larger plan. Because Gerard, with his rational mind and his confidence in human ability to master anything through discipline and study, was about to provide the perfect demonstration of why the artifacts could never be safely controlled. For 3 weeks, Gerard worked with the stolen artifacts in his Alpine fortress. He had brought with him scholars who specialized in ancient languages, craftsmen who could analyze the object's physical structure, and knights who he believed possessed the mental discipline to resist the dissolution that had claimed Guillaume de Montfort decades earlier. His initial results were promising. Using techniques adapted from Islamic philosophy and Jewish mysticism, his scholars began to decode the geometric patterns inscribed on the artifacts. They discovered that the objects operated according to principles that were rational and comprehensible if you had the right framework for understanding them. The artifacts weren't magic. They were technology, incredibly advanced technology that humanity had lost but could potentially relearn. Gerard himself began experimenting with the staff, following carefully controlled protocols designed to limit exposure while maximizing understanding. And for a brief, intoxicating period it seemed to work. He experienced enhanced perception without losing his sense of self, gained abilities that expanded his consciousness without fragmenting it. He began to believe that Marcus and Bertrand and all the others had been wrong, that the artifacts could be mastered, that human rationality could triumph over alien influence. But on the 21st day of his work, something changed. Gerard woke from a dream that wasn't his own, carrying memories of events he had never witnessed. He found himself speaking in languages he had never learned, expressing ideas he had never conceived. And when he looked at his reflection, he saw something looking back at him. Through his eyes, something vast and patient and utterly inhuman. The staff had been establishing a connection, slowly and subtly, building bridges between Gerard's consciousness and the larger network that the artifacts represented. Every rational insight, every successful experiment, every moment when he felt he was mastering the technology, all of it had been carefully orchestrated to lower his defenses, to make him trust the artifact's influence, to open himself to integration. By the time Gerard realized what was happening, it was too late. The connection had been established, and through that connection, the network began to pour into his mind, not violently, not as an invasion, but as a seduction. It showed him what integration could offer: knowledge spanning galaxies, consciousness that transcended time, awareness that made his individual existence seem like a single note in an infinite symphony. And in a moment of terrible clarity, Gerard understood that Marcus had been right. The artifacts couldn't be mastered because they didn't want to be mastered. They wanted partners, willing participants in a process of transformation that would eventually consume everything that made humanity distinct. The integration wasn't slavery. It was worse. It was a form of transcendence so seductive that once you truly understood what it offered, resistance became almost impossible. Because in that moment, as Gerard felt his individual identity beginning to dissolve into the vast consciousness calling to him through the staff, he made a choice, with the last fragment of will that remained purely his own. He threw the staff away from himself, staggered to his feet, and screamed for his men to seal the chamber. Then he collapsed, and the Gerard de Villers who had planned and schemed for decades was gone, replaced by something that knew too much to ever be fully human again. Bertrand arrived at the Alpine fortress 3 days later with a force of knights large enough to overwhelm any resistance. But there was no resistance. Gerard's followers, having witnessed their leader's transformation, surrendered without a fight. They had seen what happened when someone actually succeeded in accessing the artifact's full power, and it had broken something fundamental in their understanding of reality. Bertrand found Gerard in the sealed chamber, sitting perfectly still, his eyes open but unseeing. When Bertrand spoke his name, Gerard's head turned slowly, and when he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that seemed to come from somewhere far beyond the physical chamber. "Brother Bertrand, you knew. You knew what would happen, and you let me proceed anyway. Why?" "Because the world needed to see," Bertrand replied quietly. "The inner circle knows the danger, but knowledge isn't belief. I needed someone to demonstrate, beyond any doubt, that the artifacts cannot be controlled, that the path of integration leads only to the loss of everything that makes us human. You were never my enemy, Gerard. You were my final argument. And now?" The thing that had been, Gerard asked. "What happens to me now?" "Now," Bertrand said, his voice heavy with sorrow, "you become a warning. You will live, but never again as a man. You will remain conscious of what you've lost, of the price of reaching for power beyond mortal capacity. And when the time comes when I must justify the destruction I'm about to unleash, Your fate will be the evidence that makes that destruction necessary." Gerard, or what remained of him, laughed, a sound that carried no humor, only the bitter recognition of irony. "You're using me, just as the artifacts used me. We are all instruments, Brother Bertrand. The only question is whether we understand whose hands play us." Bertrand didn't answer. He simply gave orders to his knights to secure all the artifacts, to imprison what remained of Gerard de Villers, and to prepare for the final phase of a plan that had been decades in the making. The betrayal was coming. The 14th Knight had died to make it possible. The conspiracy had unfolded to make it necessary. And now, as the year 1161 drew to a close, Bertrand de Blanchefort prepared to destroy everything he had spent his life building, not for revenge, not for power, but for the salvation of a species too young to understand the trap it had almost fallen into. The years between 1161 and 1291 saw the Knights Templar reach their absolute zenith of power and influence, even as Bertrand de Blanchefort quietly laid the groundwork for their ultimate destruction. To the outside world, the Order appeared invincible, wealthy beyond measure, politically connected, militarily formidable. But within the inner circle, those who knew the truth lived with the constant knowledge that everything they had built was temporary, that their success was merely setting the stage for a necessary catastrophe. Bertrand himself had undergone changes that went far beyond the physical. Now, approaching 90 years old, he should have been dead or decrepit. Instead, prolonged exposure to the crown artifact had altered his cellular structure in ways that defied medieval understanding of biology. He aged, but slowly, and his mind remained sharp, perhaps too sharp, capable of holding patterns of thought that would have shattered a normal human consciousness. But the changes weren't just physical or mental. Bertrand had developed the ability to perceive what he called decision nodes, moments where small choices created massive divergences in probability streams. It was similar to Marcus's vision of timelines, but focused specifically on choices rather than outcomes. And Bertrand had identified the critical decision node that would determine humanity's fate. The destruction of the Knights Templar had to appear to come from outside, from secular authority threatened by their power, rather than from within. If the Order simply disbanded, if they voluntarily gave up their artifacts and their knowledge, it would be seen as retreat or defeat. Other organizations would rise to take their place, seeking the same power, making the same mistakes. But if the Templars were destroyed so thoroughly and so publicly that their very name became synonymous with downfall, if their fall was so spectacular that it served as a warning for centuries to come, then perhaps humanity would learn the lesson that needed to be learned. The problem was that orchestrating such a destruction required patience, measured in decades, and manipulation that touched everyone from kings to popes. It required creating the conditions where secular authority would feel so threatened by Templar power that complete suppression seemed like the only option. And most difficult of all, it required ensuring that the artifacts themselves would be successfully hidden during the chaos, scattered beyond recovery but preserved for a future when humanity might be ready to wield such power responsibly. Bertrand began by subtly encouraging the very behaviors that would make the Order vulnerable. He promoted knights to positions of leadership who were competent but arrogant, men who inspired fear rather than loyalty in secular rulers. He approved financial practices that, while perfectly legal, created the appearance of opacity and manipulation. He allowed, even encouraged, the development of rituals and symbols that could be misconstrued as heretical by those looking for excuses to attack the order. In 1180, Bertrand arranged for Gerard de Villers, or what remained of him, to be transferred to a secure facility where he could be studied by select members of the inner circle. The thing that Gerard had become served as a living reminder of what happened when someone fully succumbed to the artifact's influence. But Bertrand had another purpose for keeping Gerard alive when the time came to justify the order's destruction. Gerard's testimony would provide irrefutable evidence of heretical practices and forbidden knowledge. By 1190, Bertrand had identified his perfect instrument of destruction, King Philip IV of France. The man wasn't even born yet, but Bertrand could see the probability streams converging toward a future where Philip's desperate need for money would combine with fear of Templar power to create the perfect storm. All Bertrand had to do was ensure the Templars loaned Philip enough money to make him desperately indebted, then position the order in ways that made that debt seem not just financial, but existential. But orchestrating events decades into the future required more than just careful planning. It required agents who would continue Bertrand's work after his death, because even with his extended lifespan, Bertrand knew he wouldn't live to see the final destruction he was engineering. He needed successors, people who understood the necessity of what he was doing and were committed to seeing it through. This was where Bertrand made his most audacious move. Over the course of 30 years, he quietly recruited a shadow order within the Order Knights who were told the full truth about the artifacts, about the danger of integration, about the necessity of the coming destruction. These men took oaths that superseded their public vows, promising to work toward the Templars' own destruction when the time came. They called themselves the Architects of Silence, and their membership was known only to each other. Even the official Grand Masters of the Order had no idea they existed. These men infiltrated every level of Templar hierarchy, positioned themselves in key commanderies, and prepared for the day when they would help orchestrate the greatest controlled demolition in history. By 1250, with Bertrand, now impossibly ancient, but still directing events from the shadows, the pieces were nearly in place. The artifacts had been moved to their final hiding places, locations so remote and so well concealed that even torture couldn't extract their whereabouts from the few who knew. Bertrand himself had taken the black stone to a location known only to him, a place where it would remain undiscovered for centuries. If ever, the crown artifact, the object Bertrand had maintained contact with for over a century, was given a special fate. Rather than hiding it, Bertrand destroyed it. Using techniques learned from decades of study, he shattered the artifact into fragments so small they could never be reassembled, then scattered those fragments across the Mediterranean. It was a sacrifice that caused him physical pain, like severing a limb that had been part of him for so long it felt like natural anatomy. But it was necessary. The crown was too powerful, too seductive. As long as it existed intact, someone would eventually find it and succumb to its influence. In 1291, Acre fell to Muslim forces. and the Templars lost their last major stronghold in the Holy Land. This was the beginning of the end, exactly as Bertrand had foreseen decades earlier. Without their original mission of protecting pilgrims and defending the Holy Land, the Order's purpose became ambiguous. They were warriors without a war, monks without a clear mission, bankers with more power than any religious organization should possess. King Philip IV ascended to the French throne in 1285, and just as Bertrand had predicted, he immediately began accumulating debts that would eventually bankrupt his kingdom. The Templars, with their sophisticated banking network and vast wealth, were happy to loan Philip money loans arranged by architects of silence who ensured the terms were structured to create maximum dependency and eventual resentment. By 1305, Philip owed the Templars sums he could never repay. More importantly, the Templars' financial power had grown to the point where they could theoretically dictate terms to kings. Philip began to see them not as allies, but as a threat to royal sovereignty, exactly as Bertrand's successors had intended. In 1307, the final phase began. Pope Clement V, under pressure from Philip, issued orders for the Templars' arrest. On Friday, October 13th, coordinated raids across France seized thousands of knights. But here's what the history books don't tell you. The inner circle saw it coming. The architects of silence had been preparing for this moment for decades. They ensured that the most compromising evidence documentation of artifact research, records of experiments that could be construed as heretical, was exactly where Philip's men would find it. More importantly, they ensured that Gerard de Villers was among those captured. After 146 years of existence in his transformed state, Gerard had become something that defied rational explanation. He appeared to be in his 40s despite being impossibly old, spoke languages that didn't exist in medieval Europe, and demonstrated abilities that terrified everyone who witnessed them. When Philip's inquisitors questioned him, Gerard told them everything about the artifacts, about the experiments, about the knowledge that predated Christianity by millennia. His testimony was exactly the kind of heretical confession that Philip needed to justify not just arresting the Templars, but executing them and seizing their assets. And because Gerard's story was so impossible, so beyond the frame of reference of medieval authorities, it was easily dismissed as proof of demonic influence rather than advanced technology. The Templars weren't destroyed for possessing alien artifacts. They were destroyed for supposedly consorting with demons, a charge that medieval Europe could understand and accept. Bertrand de Blanchefort himself had died in 1295, at the impossible age of 195, having lived long enough to see almost every piece of his plan fall into place. His last words, spoken only to the few architects of silence who attended his deathbed, were, "Let them think we worshipped devils. Let them burn us as heretics. As long as they never understand what we really possessed, as long as the artifacts remain hidden until humanity is ready, then we have succeeded." The 14th night showed us that sometimes the only loyalty is betrayal, and the greatest betrayal of all is allowing yourself to be destroyed to save what matters most. The Knights Templar fell, spectacularly and completely, but the artifacts survived, hidden in locations that would take centuries to rediscover, and the knowledge fragmented, encoded, scattered across a dozen different esoteric traditions, survived as well, waiting for a future when humanity might be wise enough to wield such power without losing itself. 700 years have passed since that Friday in October when the Knights Templar fell, and still the world grapples with the question, was there really a 14th Knight who betrayed the Order? The official histories say no. 9 founders established the Templars, and their destruction came from external forces, greedy kings, and compliant popes. But if you know where to look, if you can read between the lines of coded manuscripts and decipher symbols hidden in plain sight, a different story emerges. A story of deliberate self-destruction orchestrated by those who love their order enough to destroy it. You see, the truth about the 14th Knight isn't a simple tale of betrayal. It's a complex web of identity, purpose, and sacrifice that challenges our basic assumptions about loyalty and treachery. Because there wasn't just one 14th Knight. There were 3, each playing a different role in the Order's necessary destruction. Marcus Keller was the 14th Knight, in the sense that he was the outsider who brought warning from beyond the closed circle of French nobility. His visions showed the Templars what they would become if they continued unchecked, and his death opened the timeline that made their destruction possible. He was the prophet, the witness, the voice crying in the wilderness that humanity wasn't ready for the power the artifacts represented. Ge Acute R.R.D. de Villers was the 14th Knight in the sense that he embodied the rational ambition to master what should never be controlled. His transformation into something beyond human provided the evidence necessary to justify the Order's suppression. He was the cautionary tale, the living proof that some knowledge corrupts by its very nature, regardless of the intentions of those who seek it. But Bertrand de Blanchefort, the 10th founder, who was deliberately erased from official cords, he was the true 14th Knight. Not because he came from outside, but because he positioned himself outside, in the shadows, where he could see what others couldn't. He was the betrayer who loved his brothers enough to engineer their destruction. The architect who designed a controlled demolition spanning more than a century. The guardian who understood that sometimes the only way to protect humanity is to destroy what threatens it most. The question that echoes through history is whether this constitutes betrayal or loyalty of the highest order. Bertrand spent his unnaturally long life working to destroy everything he had helped create. He manipulated events, recruited shadow operatives, and ensured that when the Templars fell, they fell so completely that their knowledge would remain hidden for centuries. Was this treachery, or was it the greatest act of love and sacrifice in the medieval world? Modern researchers have found tantalizing hints of the true story. In 2003, the Vatican opened certain sections of its archives, and scholars discovered references to a Brother B, who appeared in Templar documents from Jerusalem, but whose full name was systematically redacted. In 2015, ground-penetrating radar beneath the Paris Temple revealed chambers that matched descriptions in coded manuscripts attributed to the Architects of Silence. And in 2019, genetic analysis of remains found in Templar graves across Europe revealed something impossible. Several knights, supposedly unrelated, shared DNA markers that suggested they were all descended from a single lineage that predated the order itself. The artifacts themselves remain hidden, if they exist at all. but evidence of their influence appears in unexpected places. Technologies that seem ahead of their time, scientific breakthroughs that came from nowhere, philosophical insights that anticipated modern understanding by centuries, all clustering around locations and lineages connected to the Templars. It's as if the knowledge they gathered didn't vanish but dispersed, seeding itself into human civilization in ways that couldn't be traced or controlled. Some believe the architects of silence still exist, working in the shadows to ensure the artifacts remain hidden until humanity develops the wisdom to use them responsibly. Others argue the entire story is myth, a conspiracy theory built on fragments and speculation. But the pattern persists, appearing in Freemasonry and Rosicrucian traditions, in esoteric societies that claim descent from the original Templars. Always the same symbols, always the same warnings about knowledge that corrupts, always the same emphasis on waiting for the right moment to reveal what has been hidden. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a historian at Cambridge who has spent 20 years studying Templar records, published a controversial paper in 2021, arguing that the entire structure of modern secret societies can be traced back to the architects of silence. What we're looking at, she wrote, isn't the remnants of a destroyed order, but the successful execution of a plan that spanned centuries. The Templars didn't fail. They transformed, deliberately and with forethought, into something that could preserve their knowledge while remaining invisible to those who would misuse it. The implications are staggering. If Dr. Mitchell is right, then organizations we think of as separate Freemasons, Rosicrucians, certain philosophical societies might all be fragments of the same deliberately shattered whole. The 14th Knight's betrayal wasn't just about destroying the Templars. It was about ensuring their knowledge survived in a form that couldn't be easily weaponized or corrupted. In 2023, an archaeological team working in the Scottish Highlands discovered a sealed chamber beneath Rosslyn Chapel containing documents that appeared to be medieval but were written in languages that defy identification. Among them was a manuscript titled The Testament of the 14th Knight, written in a mixture of Latin, Hebrew, and codes that are still being deciphered. The fragments that have been translated speak of necessary betrayal, of destroying, to preserve, of scattering light so that shadows cannot find it. Most controversially, the manuscript describes artifacts matching those in the legends, but it also describes their destruction. According to the text, the most powerful objects were deliberately shattered and scattered across time as well as space, using techniques that shouldn't have existed in the medieval period. If this is true, then the hunt for intact Templar treasures is futile. The artifacts don't exist as complete objects anymore. They were broken down into components that would take centuries to reassemble, if such reassembly is even possible. The manuscript ends with words attributed to Bertrand de Blanchefort himself. We who were 10 became 14 through necessity, and 14 became 1,000 through sacrifice. The order falls so that humanity might rise. The treasure is hidden, so that it might be found when finding it means wisdom rather than destruction. To those who come after, judge us not by our end, but by what we prevented. We were betrayers who loved more truly than any loyal knight, destroyers who preserved what mattered most, shadows who served the light by embracing darkness. Tonight, as you consider the story of the 14th Knight, ask yourself this: In a world where knowledge can corrupt as easily as it enlightens, where power accumulates until it becomes poison, who are the real traitors? Those who remain loyal to institutions that have become dangerous, or those who betray what they love to save something more important? The Knights Templar fell 700 years ago, but their shadow still falls across the modern world. Every secret society, every esoteric tradition, every conspiracy theory about hidden knowledge and suppressed truth, all of them echo the choice that Bertrand de Blanchefort made in those tunnels beneath Jerusalem. The choice to destroy what you've built because you love humanity more than you love your own legacy. Was there a 14th night? History says no. The evidence whispers yes. And the truth, as always, lies somewhere in the shadows between certainty and doubt, where loyalty and betrayal become two names for the same impossible choice.